ain't one for fancy offices, but the law firm of Whitaker, Stone, and Phelps in Boston had a shine to it that could make a pauper feel like a king. The place smelled of polished mahogany and money so old it might have been minted by the Pilgrims themselves. I'm Nora Caldwell, 38 years young, though I felt every one of those years as I sat in that waiting room, my heart thumping like a drum at a funeral. Across from me, my stepmother, Vivian Hart, held court with her two vipers, Ethan and Lila, their eyes gleaming with the kind of greed that make a riverboat gambler blush. "Lila, darling," Vivian purred, her voice smooth as silk and twice as slippery. "We'll get that Cape Cod estate fixed up proper. 10 bedrooms, maybe 12. Ethan, scrolling his phone like it held the secrets of the universe, chimed in, "I'm thinking a yacht, Ma. The 70-footer I saw in Miami ain't nothing finer." Vivian's manicured nails, sharp enough to cut glass, patted their hands. "Patience, my dears. We'll divvy up your daddy's fortune soon enough." Her eyes, cold as a winter's night, flicked to me. "Though I don't know why she's here," she said, loud enough for the portraits on the walls to hear. "Nora's got no claim to a dime." I kept my days on my phone, pretending to read emails, but her words stung like a wasp. 7 years she'd been clawing at my father's wealth, and now she thought she'd won. The receptionist, a prim woman with a bun tighter than a miser's purse, appeared. "Mr. Whitaker will see you now." We filed into the conference room where Samuel Whitaker waited, my father's will spread before him like a map to buried treasure. His face was all business, but his eyes danced with a mischief I couldn't place. "Please sit," he said, waving at the chairs. "Water? Coffee? This might take a spell." "Let's make this quick," Vivian snapped, settling into the head chair like she owned the place. "I've got a meeting with my banker at 3. Whitaker opened the folder, his lips twitching. "We're here to read the last will of Thomas Caldwell, a client of mine for nigh on 30 years. Vivian cut in, her voice sharp as a razor. "Yes, very tragic. Now about the estate." That's when she leaned forward, her smile wicked as a fox in a henhouse. "Nora, dear, I made sure you're out of the will. Not a penny for you." The room went still. Ethan smirked. Lila flipped her hair. And Mr. Whitaker, he started to laugh, a low, rumbling chuckle that rolled through the room like thunder. I ain't never seen a woman's face fall so fast as Vivian's did right then. Now, if you're as curious as I was about what made that lawyer laugh, hit that subscribe button and ring the bell. I've got more tales like this, and you won't want to miss a one. Vivian's face, still smarting from that lawyer's laugh, took on a look of pure spite, like a cat that'd been dunked in a rain barrel. She leaned back in her chair, her lips pursed tight, and fixed me with a stare that could have curdled cream. I kept my hands folded, my heart racing like a steamboat on the Mississippi, but I didn't let her see it. Mr. Whitaker, his eyes still twinkling with that secret mirth, cleared his throat and rustled his papers. He held up a document, thick as a Bible and twice as heavy, and the room seemed to hold its breath. 5 years ago, Vivian had crowed about how she and my father redrafted his will, locking me out like a stray dog. She'd gone on about immediate family and how I, with my nonprofit work, hadn't cared enough to visit. Never mind that she'd schemed to keep me away, scheduling dinners when I was out of town, or telling my father I was too busy to see him. Whitaker's voice cut through her smugness like a knife through butter. He spoke of a trust, the Caldwell Family Trust, set up 28 years ago when I was a girl of 10, with pigtails and dreams bigger than Boston Harbor. My father, Thomas, had poured his fortune into it. Every stock, every bond, every deed to the Cape Cod estate, the Aspen Chalet, the Boston penthouse. Vivian's eyes narrowed, her confidence wobbling like a poorly built bridge. She snapped that my father had revoked that trust when they married, her voice sharp enough to cut glass. But Whitaker, cool as a cucumber, pulled out another paper, this one dated 13 months back. The trust, he explained, had transferred to me 14 months ago on my 38th birthday. $60 million, give or take, all mine before Vivian even knew it was gone. Her face went pale, like she'd seen the ghost of her own schemes. Ethan's jaw dropped, and Lila's fingers froze mid-hair flip. Whitaker went on, his tone steady, but his eyes alight. The trust wasn't part of the will, see? It stood apart, untouchable. And my father had timed it just so, knowing Vivian's greed would blind her. I sat quiet, my mind flashing to that birthday party, a small affair my father had thrown at his office. Vivian had been off at a spa, no doubt plotting her next grab. He'd hugged me tight that day, his eyes full of knowing I hadn't understood till now. Vivian's voice, when it came, was a whisper, thin as thread. She asked if the trust could be undone, her hands trembling like leaves in a storm. Whitaker shook his head, his smile creeping wider. And then he dropped the real bombshell, a clause buried deep in the trust's fine print. If Vivian or her kin tried to contest it, they'd face penalties so steep they'd lose even the shirts on their backs. My father, it seemed, hadn't just outsmarted her, he'd laid a trap. The air in that Boston law office grew thick as molasses, and Vivian's face, once so smug, now looked like she'd swallowed a hornet's nest. Her hands gripped the table, knuckles white as fresh snow, while Ethan and Lila sat dumbstruck, their dreams of yachts and mansions sinking faster than a lead canoe. Mr. Whitaker, with the calm of a man who'd seen every kind of human folly, laid out the trust's workings like a preacher reading scripture. That Caldwell family trust, he said, held every scrap of my father's wealth, $60 million in climbing thanks to dividends and a market that'd been kinder than a spring breeze. The Cape Cod estate with its sprawling lawns and ocean views, the Aspen Chalet nestled in snow-draped pines, the Boston penthouse gleaming over the city like a crown jewel, all of it had passed to me 14 months ago on my 38th birthday. Vivian's eyes darted, searching for a crack in the truth, but there wasn't one. She'd been living in my houses, driving my cars, spending my money, all while thinking she'd pulled the wool over my father's eyes. The irony was sweeter than honey, and I let it settle in my bones, though I kept my face still as a pond at dawn. Whitaker went on, his voice steady but laced with a glee he couldn't quite hide. The trust's transfer had been clean as a whistle, timed to the day I turned 38, before Vivian could sniff out the plan. My father had known her greed would keep her distracted, and he'd played her like a fiddle. Then came the kicker, the clause that made Vivian's breath catch like a fish on a hook. If she or her children dared contest the trust, they'd trigger a penalty, a legal snare that stripped them of any claim and opened their finances to scrutiny. My father hadn't just protected me, he'd built a cage for Vivian's ambition, and she'd walked right into it. I nodded when Whitaker asked about my birthday, my voice soft but sure. I recalled that quiet party, just me and my father, sharing cake in his study, while Vivian was off pampering herself. He'd smiled then, a smile that held secrets, and now I knew why. Vivian's denial broke through, her voice shrill like a kettle on the boil. She insisted it was impossible, that my father would have told her, his wife. But Whitaker, with the patience that shame a saint, showed her the documents, signed, sealed, and notarized. The trust was ironclad, and she was out in the cold. Ethan's voice cracked as he muttered about the yacht he'd never sail. Lila's fingers twitched, her dreams of a designer wardrobe crumbling like dry leaves. Vivian, though, was a statue, her face pale as death, her mind no doubt racing for a way to claw back what she'd lost. But there was no way out. My father's plan had been a masterpiece, painted in the quiet moments when Vivian thought she ruled the roost. And I, sitting there with the weight of $60 million in my name, felt the first stirrings of a triumph I'd waited 14 months to claim. Vivian's silence hung heavy in that Boston law office, like the calm before a thunderstorm.
Her eyes, once sharp with malice, now flickered with a fear that make a cornered fox tremble. I sat across from her, my heart steady, but my mind ablaze with the truth my father had uncovered. Mr. Whitaker, with the air of a man who'd seen greed unravel 1,000 times, slid a thick folder across the table.
My father, Thomas, hadn't just outwitted Vivian with his trust. He'd hired a private investigator 2 years back, a shark-eyed fellow who dug into her schemes like a hound after a bone. The reports, stacked high as a harvest moon, laid bare her treachery. She'd run up credit cards in my father's name, siphoning funds to Ethan's gambling debts and Leela's endless shopping sprees. She'd isolated him from old friends, claiming they were after his money, while moving her own kin into the Cape Cod estate without so much as a by your leave. Worst of all, the investigator found traces of tampering with my father's medical records, prescriptions altered, dosages shifted, enough to keep him foggy and pliable. Vivian's face, already pale, went gray as a gravestone. She tried to muster a denial, but her voice faltered, thin as a reed in a gale. The room seemed to shrink around her, the weight of those papers pressing down like a judge's gavel. Whitaker, his tone as calm as a Sunday sermon, added fuel to the fire. He produced medical reports, signed by 3 doctors, proving my father's mind was sharp as a razor 13 months ago, when he'd last amended the trust. No fog of illness or manipulation could cloud that truth. Then came the shadow of Vivian's past, a dark thread the investigator had unraveled. Before my father, she'd run a business deal in Chicago, a real estate venture that smelled of fraud. Partners cheated, funds vanished, and Vivian walking away with a tidy sum. The papers hinted at more, enough to make a district attorney sit up and take notice. I watched her squirm, my own anger rising like a tide. I thought of the time she kept me from my father, claiming I was too busy, when all I'd wanted was to sit with him, to hear his stories of the old days. I thought of his weary eyes in those final months, not clouded by sickness, but by her cunning. Vivian's hands twitched, as if she could tear the truth apart like so much paper. But the truth ain't so easily undone, and my father had made sure of it. He'd seen her for what she was, a thief in widow's weeds, cloaking her greed in a wife's devotion. The air grew tighter, the silence broken only by Ethan's nervous shifting and Leela's shallow breaths. They knew, as I did, that the game was up. My father's foresight had stripped them bare, and the weight of his justice settled over us all, heavy as a winter's snow. The law office, with its polished wood and stern portraits, seemed to hum with the weight of what had come before. Vivian sat rigid, her face a mask of shock, while Ethan and Leela slumped like puppets with cut strings, their dreams of wealth scattered like leaves in a storm. Mr. Whitaker, his eyes still carrying that spark of mischief, turned to the will itself, a slim document compared to the trust's hefty tomes. He read it slow, each word landing like a pebble in a still pond. My father, Thomas, had left Vivian Hart, his wife of 7 years, the sum of $1, the measure of her worth, as he'd written. To Ethan and Lila, her children, he left the same, a single $1 each, a token of his scorn for their greed. The room gasped, though I reckon it was more the principle than the amount. $1, crisp and green, lay on the table for each of them, gleaming under the chandelier's light. Vivian's hand twitched, as if she might snatch it up, but pride, or shame, kept her still. Whitaker went on, explaining that the rest of the estate, mostly personal trinkets since the trust had claimed the real wealth, passed to me. But I had my own surprise to share, one I'd kept close as a card-sharp's ace. From my purse, I drew 3 envelopes, each marked with a name: Vivian, Ethan, Lila. Eviction notices, I declared, my voice steady as a ship's keel. They had 30 days to vacate my properties: the Cape Cod estate, with its ocean breezes, the Aspen chalet where snow clung like a lover,
and the Boston penthouse, where Ethan had thrown parties he thought I'd never hear of. Vivian shot to her feet, her chair scraping like a banshee's wail. She claimed her rights as a widow, her voice rising to a pitch that could have cracked glass. But I met her gaze, cool as a winter's morn, and reminded her she was no more than a tenant, living rent-free in houses that had been mine for 14 months. Ethan stammered, his face red as a lobster, asking how I knew of his city debts. Lila's hands fluttered, her dreams of designer gowns fading like mist. But Vivian turned to threats, vowing to drag the trust through every court in Massachusetts. She didn't know about the trust's hidden clause, the one Whitaker had mentioned earlier. Any challenge would trigger penalties, stripping her of what little she had left and laying her finances bare to the law's scrutiny. My father had woven a net, and Vivian was thrashing in it, blind to the ropes tightening around her. I stood, gathering my copies of the documents, my heart pounding but my resolve firm. The dollar bills lay untouched, a symbol of my father's judgment, and I left them there, a silent rebuke to the trio's avarice. The balance of power had shifted, and for the first time in years, I felt the weight of my father's love, steady as a lighthouse in a storm. The law office seemed to hush, as if the very walls leaned in to listen. Vivian sat crumpled, her fire doused, while Ethan and Lila stared at the dollar bills like they might sprout wings and fly away. Mr. Whitaker, his hand steady as a surgeon's, handed me an envelope, its edges worn but sealed with my father's careful hand. He'd wanted me to read it aloud, Whitaker said, and I felt a pang, sharp as a thorn, at the thought of my father's voice carried in those words. I broke the seal, my fingers trembling, and unfolded the letter, recognizing the slanted script that once filled my childhood with notes tucked in lunchboxes.
My father, Thomas, had written with a clarity that cut through the room's tension like a beacon. He spoke of his illness, a cancer that had crept in just weeks after he'd married Vivian. He'd hoped she'd care for him, as a wife should, but instead she'd shown her true colors, scheming, cold, and hungry for his fortune. He'd suspected her of tampering with his medical records, slipping in changes to keep him weak, his mind clouded. The private investigator had found traces of it, enough to warrant a district attorney's glance, and my father had sent the evidence along to be reviewed after his passing. To me, he wrote words that warmed my heart like a hearth fire. He thanks me for trusting him, for playing along when he'd asked me to step back, to let Vivian think she'd won. I had pretended to drift away, letting her spin her lies, while he moved his wealth into the trust, securing my future. He praised my patience, my strength, and called me the daughter he'd always dreamed of, kind, sharp, and true. To Vivian, Ethan, and Lila, he left a warning. The investigators' reports were with the law, and their 30 days to vacate might be their last chance to slip free of justice's grasp. My voice caught as I read his closing, a farewell that felt like his arms around me once more. He urged me to care for the fortune, but more to care for myself, to live the life he'd fought to protect. A postscript mentioned my mother's sapphire necklace, hidden in his office safe, a treasure Vivian had coveted but never touched. The room was still as a churchyard. Vivian's face was a mask of defeat, her hands limp in her lap. Ethan stared at the floor, his bravado gone, while Lila's mascara streaked her cheeks like rivers of ink. I folded the letter, my heart heavy with love and loss. My father had seen through Vivian's mask, and he'd built a fortress around me, not of stone, but of cunning and care. The weight of his plan settled over me, a mantle I'd carry with pride, knowing I'd honored his trust in a way Vivian never could. The law office, with its heavy air and gleaming wood, felt like a stage where the final act was unfolding. Vivian's defeat hung about her like a tattered cloak, but her eyes still sparked with a desperate fire, the kind that drives a cornered beast to lash out. Mr. Whitaker, his calm unshaken, produced one last document, a restraining order I'd filed that very morning. It barred Vivian, Ethan, and Leela from contacting me once they left my properties, with the threat of swift enforcement if they dared contest the trust or will. My father's plan had been thorough, but I'd added this shield, knowing Vivian's spite might outlast her defeat. She rose, her voice trembling with a mix of rage and plea. She called out to me, claiming her years as my father's wife should count for something, her hands outstretched like a beggar's. But I saw the truth in her eyes. Greed, not grief, drove her words. I stood firm, my heart hardened by the memory of her schemes.
I spoke of the safe I'd found in my father's office, hidden behind a portrait of my mother. Inside were papers, damning ones, detailing Vivian's Chicago fraud, a real estate scam that left partners ruined and her pockets lined. The district attorney, I said, would find them most interesting. Vivian's face drained of color, her breath catching like a snagged thread. She denied it, her voice sharp but brittle, claiming the past was unproven. I didn't argue, for the truth needed no defense. My father had known of her first husband, a man who died under a cloud of suspicion, his insurance policy fattening Vivian's bank account. The parallels to my father's case were too stark to ignore, and he'd been wise to her playbook. Ethan shifted, his eyes darting like a thief's, while Leela clutched her purse, her dreams of luxury now dust. Vivian's threats grew wilder, vowing to haunt me through the courts, but the restraining order lay between us, a wall she couldn't climb. I gathered my papers, my resolve as steady as a ship's mast. My father had outsmarted her, and I'd followed his lead, stepping carefully through the minefield of her deceit. I turned to her one last time, my voice low but clear. Her marriage to my father, I said, was worth exactly what she'd brought to it: lies, manipulation, and a hunger that'd never be sated. He'd priced her true value at $1, and I reckoned he'd been generous. The room seemed to exhale as I moved toward the door, leaving Vivian to her ruin. My father's justice had been swift and sure, and I carried it with me, a torch to light my way through the storm she'd tried to brew. The Boston air was crisp as I stepped from the law office, my heart still thrumming with the day's weight. I slid into my car, mine in truth now, not just the trust's, and let out a breath I'd held for 14 months, like a sailor loosing the sails after a gale. My phone buzzed, and it was Ellen, my father's nurse, the one soul Vivian couldn't bully or bribe away. Her voice, warm as a quilt, came through, asking how the will reading had gone. I told her it played out just as my father had foretold, down to Vivian's sputtered denials and the lawyer's sly grin. Ellen chuckled, soft and knowing, and spoke of my father's final weeks. He'd talked of me without cease, she said, his eyes lighting up at the mention of my name. To him, I was the one who'd never asked for aught but his time, who'd sat with him through long evenings, listening to tales of his youth, while Vivian schemed in the shadows. I felt a pang, sharp as a splinter, for those days were gone. My father's laugh, his way of spinning a story till you saw the world anew, lived only in memory now. Yet Ellen's words wrapped around me, a comfort against the grief that clung like damp fog. She told me how he'd planned it all, even as his strength waned. He'd known Vivian's heart, seen her for the vulture she was, and he'd worked in secret to shield me.
The trust, the investigator, the safe with its secrets. He'd woven a tapestry of justice, each thread placed with care. I thought of the lies Vivian had spread, claiming I'd abandoned my father when I'd been at his side whenever she'd let me near. Ellen had seen it too, had watched Vivian turn away my calls, claiming my father was resting. But he'd known, always, that I was there, and that knowledge was a balm to my soul. The car's engine hummed, steady as my resolve, as I spoke of the safe's contents,
those papers that could bring Vivian low. Ellen's voice grew quiet, saying my father would have been proud, not for the victory over Vivian, but for my strength in carrying his plan through. He'd cared only for my safety, she said, not for punishing them, though he'd relished the thought of their shock. I smiled, picturing his sly grin, the one he'd worn when we'd signed the trust papers while Vivian was off at some spa, thinking herself the queen of all she surveyed. The call ended, and I sat in the quiet, my heart full of love and loss. My father's legacy wasn't just the fortune he'd left, but the trust he'd placed in me, a gift heavier and sweeter than all the gold in Boston. The cemetery lay quiet under a sky gray as a Quaker's coat, the headstones standing like sentinels over memories. I walked the path to my father's grave, my steps slow but sure, the weight of the day still clinging to me like dew on grass. His stone was simple, etched with his name, Thomas Caldwell, and dates that told too short a story. Fresh flowers covered it, roses and lilies I'd brought each week, though Vivian had spread lies that I'd never come. I knelt, brushing a petal aside, and felt the ache of his absence sharp as a blade. I placed a single rose, coral bright from my mother's garden, the one I'd tended since I was a girl. It was his favorite, a bloom he'd said held her spirit, and I reckoned it belonged here, where his heart rested. The wind stirred the trees, and for a moment I could almost hear his laugh, that deep rumble that warmed our old house on winter nights. My mind drifted to 14 months back, when we'd sat in Mr. Whitaker's office, signing papers while Vivian pampered herself at a spa. He'd leaned close then, his eyes twinkling with mischief, and said Vivian thought herself clever, but clever ain't the same as smart. I was smart, he'd said, because I knew the difference between tending a soul and plundering it. We'd done it, I whispered to the stone, just as he'd planned. Vivian and her brood never saw it coming, blindsided by the trust, the safe, the truth he'd buried like treasure. The victory was sweet, but sweeter still was knowing I'd honored him, stepping through the dance of his design without a misstep. I thought of the safe's contents, those papers that could send Vivian to a reckoning. The district attorney would have them soon, and I reckoned justice would follow, slow but sure. My father had seen her for what she was, a thief in a widow's veil, and he'd made sure I'd stand tall when she fell. The rose gleamed against the stone, a spark of life in the quiet. I stood, my heart lighter, though grief lingered like a shadow. He taught me to see through cunning, to value wisdom over flash, and that lesson was a legacy no fortune could match. The wind rose again, carrying the scent of earth and blooms, and I turned from the grave, my steps firm. The plan was done, the truth laid bare, and I carried his love with me, a compass for the road ahead. The Boston dusk wrapped around me like a worn shawl as I drove from the cemetery, the city's lights flickering like stars caught in a net. My car, a modest thing my father had bought in my name years back, hummed steady, a far cry from the sleek machines Vivian's brood had driven on my dime. I was headed home, not to the Cape Cod estate where Vivian was likely tearing through closets in a panic, nor to the Aspen Chalet or the Boston Penthouse, but to a small house in Jamaica Plain, a secret gift from my father. He'd bought it quiet-like, years ago, when he first saw Vivian's true colors, a haven where I'd lived these past months, letting her think I was scraping by, while the trust swelled like a river in spring. The house was no palace, mind you, just a cozy 2-story with a porch that creaked and windows that caught the morning sun. But it was mine, rooted in my father's love, and that made it grander than any mansion Vivian ever coveted. I thought of him as I drove, his sly grin when he'd handed me the deed, saying it was a place to weather any storm. Vivian's cleverness had been her undoing, all flash and no substance, like a firecracker that fizzles before it pops. My father, though, was smart, the kind of smart that sees through masks and builds bridges over traps. He'd known her greed would blind her, and he'd played her like a master fiddler, every note of his plan ringing true. I parked in the driveway, the gravel crunching under my tires, and sat a moment, the engine's hum fading into the night's quiet. The weight of the day, Vivian's defeat, the trust's revelation, my father's letter, settled over me, heavy but warm, like a quilt stitched with care. I'd won, not just the fortune, but the right to carry his legacy, to live as he'd hoped, free of the vultures that circled him. Inside, the house smelled of cedar and the lavender I'd planted out back, a scent that always brought my mother to mind. I lit a lamp, its glow soft against the walls, and sank into the armchair my father had loved, one of the few things I'd taken from the estate before Vivian could claim it. My mind wandered to the safe's papers, now in Mr. Whitaker's hands, bound for the district attorney. Vivian's fraud, her tampering, her past, they'd catch up to her. Slow as justice is, but sure as sunrise. My father had laid the path, and I'd walked it, not for vengeance, but for the truth he'd cherished.
I glanced at the desk where I kept his letters, each one a piece of his heart. The sapphire necklace, my mother's, lay there too, its stones catching the light like captured stars. He'd hidden it from Vivian's grasping hands, and now it was mine, a tether to both my parents, a reminder of love that outlasted greed. The future stretched before me, wide as the sea. The fortune was vast, but I'd use it as he taught me, wisely, to build, to help, to honor the good he'd seen in me. My nonprofit work, mocked by Vivian, would grow, touching lives she'd never understand. I stepped to the porch, the night air cool against my skin, and looked up at the stars. My father was gone, but his lessons, his trust, his love, they were with me, steady as the tide. Vivian's cleverness had crumbled, but his smartness and mine would endure, a foundation stronger than any she could have dreamed.